In the scorching summer of 1882, a grieving Wyoming rancher made a split-second decision at a courthouse auction that would scandalize his entire community. When Samuel Morrison bid on a widow and her 5 children, he thought he was simply preventing their separation. But what happened next would challenge everything the Wild West believed about family, redemption, and the true meaning of home. Could one desperate act of compassion really transform 7 broken lives forever? The crack of the auctioneer's hammer echoed across Cheyenne's dusty courthouse square like gunshots in the Wyoming Territory heat. Samuel Morrison wiped sweat from his forehead, clutching a crumpled piece of paper that had arrived 3 weeks ago, the final notice on his ranch mortgage. Around him, desperate folks gathered like vultures, ready to pick clean the bones of other people's broken dreams. It was July 15, 1882, and the summer sun showed no mercy to anyone standing in that courthouse yard. Samuel's worn boots kicked at the packed dirt as he watched families say goodbye to everything they'd worked for. The smell of sagebrush mixed with human sweat and horse manure, creating the bitter perfume of hard times. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him that breakfast had been nothing but black coffee again. Margaret would have scolded him for skipping meals, but Margaret wasn't here anymore. She'd been gone 4 months now, taken by the fever that swept through Wyoming that spring. The empty ranch house felt like a tomb, and some days Samuel wondered if joining her might be easier than facing another sunrise alone. "Next up, we have the Baxter family's prize bull," shouted auctioneer Hayes, a thin man with a voice that could wake the dead. "Fine breeding stock, gentlemen. Who'll start the bidding at $20? Samuel barely paid attention to the bull or the excited bidding that followed. His mind wandered to the stack of unpaid bills sitting on his kitchen table, growing taller each week like weeds after rain. The bank had been patient, more patient than he deserved, but patience had limits even in Wyoming. A commotion near the courthouse steps caught his attention. A woman in a faded blue dress stood with 5 children clustered around her like chicks around a hen. The oldest looked to be about 14, a girl with serious eyes and brown hair pulled back tight. 2 boys who looked like twins flanked her, maybe 10 years old, both skinny as fence posts. A little girl with golden curls hid behind the woman's skirts, and in the woman's arms, a baby fussed quietly. "That's the Hartwell bunch," whispered old Pete Jenkins, who ran the general store. "Heard their pa died owing near $200 to the Territorial Bank. Poor souls got nowhere to go." Samuel studied the family more closely. The woman, she couldn't be more than 30, held her head high despite the curious stares from the crowd. Her dress had been mended several times, but it was clean and pressed. The children were thin but not starving, and their clothes, while patched, were neat and tidy. "Mary Hartwell keeps a tidy house," Pete continued, following Samuel's gaze. "Smart woman too. Taught school before she married. But with Thomas gone and all those debts," he shook his head sadly. The auctioneer's voice boomed again, but this time Samuel's blood ran cold. "Ladies and gentlemen, we now come to the final item of today's proceedings. Due to outstanding debts of the deceased Thomas Hartwell, we have for auction the remaining family members." Samuel's hands clenched into fists. He'd heard of such things but never witnessed it himself. In the territories, when a man died owing more than his property could cover, sometimes the family became responsible for the debt. If they couldn't pay, they could be auctioned to work off what was owed. "Now, this here's a complete family unit," Hayes continued, his voice taking on the same tone he'd used for livestock. "One widow capable of household management and teaching, for children old enough for light work, and 1 infant. Opening bid is $50 for the entire lot." The crowd stirred uncomfortably. Some folks shuffled their feet and looked away, while others leaned forward with interest. Samuel felt sick to his stomach. These weren't cattle or furniture. They were human beings with feelings and fears and dreams. $50, called out a rough voice from the back. Samuel turned to see Jake Morrison, no relation despite the shared name, a rancher known for working his hands harder than his horses. Mary Hartwell's face went pale, but she didn't move or cry out. The teenage girl, Rebecca, Samuel heard someone whisper, stepped closer to her mother, her young face set with determination that reminded Samuel of Margaret when she'd made up her mind about something. 60, shouted another voice. This time it was Jeremiah Cobb, and Samuel's jaw tightened. Cobb owned the largest spread in the territory and had a reputation for being harder than winter on the folks who worked for him. Stories circulated about families who'd gone to work for Cobb and were never quite the same afterward. The baby in Mary's arms began to cry, as if sensing the tension in the air. She bounced him gently, whispering soft words that Samuel couldn't hear but could feel in his chest. The little girl with golden curls peeked out from behind her mother's skirts, blue eyes wide with confusion and fear. $75. Cobb called out again, his voice confident and cold. Samuel's heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped bird. His own troubles seemed small compared to what this family faced. At least when he lost his ranch, he'd lose it alone. These folks would be split up, scattered to whoever needed workers, probably never to see each other again. The auctioneer raised his hammer. 75 going once. Time seemed to slow down for Samuel. He thought about Margaret and how she'd always said that good people should help each other when times got tough. He thought about his empty house and his empty life. He thought about the money in his pocket. Money he'd been saving to make one last payment on his mortgage, knowing it probably wouldn't be enough anyway. 75 going twice. Samuel's hand shot up before his brain could stop it. $100, he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. The entire courthouse square fell silent except for the baby's soft whimpering. Every head turned toward Samuel, and he felt the weight of dozens of stares pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. His heart hammered so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. Did Morrison just bid on that family? Someone whispered loudly enough for half the crowd to hear. $100, the auctioneer repeated, his eyebrows raised in surprise. Do I hear 110? Jeremiah Cobb's cold eyes fixed on Samuel across the crowd. The man's face showed no emotion, but Samuel could feel the calculation happening behind those pale blue eyes. Cobb had more money than most folks in the territory, but he was also known for not spending a penny more than necessary on anything. 125, Cobb called out, his voice steady and confident. Samuel's mouth went dry. He had exactly $137 in his pocket money he'd scraped together by selling his last 2 horses and his wife's jewelry. It was supposed to buy him 1 more month at the ranch, maybe 2 if he was careful with food. Mary Hartwell looked directly at him for the first time, and Samuel saw something in her eyes that made his chest tight. Not hope exactly, but a kind of desperate courage that reminded him of a cornered animal that still had fight left in it. The teenage girl, Rebecca, whispered something to her mother, but Mary shook her head slightly. The twin boys stood perfectly still, their young faces serious beyond their years. Even the little girl had stopped hiding, watching the proceedings with the kind of intense attention that children save for moments they sense will change everything. $135, Samuel called out, his voice stronger this time. A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through wheat. That was more money than most folks in Cheyenne saw in 3 months. Pete Jenkins whistled low under his breath, and several people turned to stare at Samuel with new interest. Cobb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Samuel had known the man for 5 years, had sold cattle to him twice, and had learned to read the subtle signs of Cobb's displeasure. The rancher didn't like being challenged, especially not in public, and especially not by someone he considered beneath his notice. 140, Cobb said, but there was something different in his voice now. Less confidence, more irritation. Samuel's heart sank. He had exactly $2 left after 135. $2 wouldn't buy him another bid, wouldn't save this family, wouldn't change anything at all. But then something unexpected happened. Old Pete Jenkins stepped forward from the crowd, fishing in his vest pocket. "Sam," he said quietly, "I got $20 says you're doing the right thing here." Another voice spoke up from behind them. "Make that 40. Samuel turned to see Doc Williams, the territory's only physician, holding out folded bills. "Been owing you for that beef you brought my family during the fever outbreak. Call it even." More voices joined in. "Got $10 here." Count me in for 15. Here's 5, Sam, it's all I got, but it's yours. Samuel stared in amazement as neighbors and acquaintances, some he barely knew, pressed money into his hands. In less than 2 minutes, he had enough for another bid, then another if needed. $160, Samuel called out, his voice now steady with the backing of his community. Cobb's face had gone red around the edges. He looked around the square, taking in the faces of people who had clearly chosen sides. Some watched him with open dislike, others with careful neutrality, but very few with the support he was used to commanding. 170, Cobb said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Samuel looked at the money in his hands, the contributions from neighbors who barely had enough for themselves but had chosen to help anyway. He thought about Margaret's voice reading from her Bible on Sunday mornings, about how she'd always said that sometimes God worked through ordinary people doing extraordinary things. $200, Samuel said clearly. The crowd gasped. Even the auctioneer looked surprised. $200 was more than many families earned in an entire year. It was enough to buy a small farm, a dozen head of cattle, or a year's worth of supplies. Cobb stood perfectly still for a long moment, his pale eyes moving from Samuel to the crowd to the Hartwell family and back again. Samuel could practically see the man's mind working, weighing the cost against his pride, calculating whether winning this particular battle was worth the price. 200 going once, the auctioneer called out. Cobb opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. His gaze lingered on Mary Hartwell and her children, and for just a moment, Samuel thought he saw something almost like regret in the man's expression. 200 going twice. The silence stretched out like a taut rope ready to snap. Even the baby had stopped crying, as if sensing that something important was happening. The little girl with golden curls peeked out from behind her mother's skirts again, her blue eyes moving from face to face in the crowd. Sold! The auctioneer's hammer came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo off every building in Cheyenne. To Samuel Morrison for $200. The crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers, applause, and excited chatter. Samuel stood frozen in the middle of it all, suddenly realizing what he'd just done. He'd bought a family. 6 human beings were now his responsibility, and he had no idea what came next. Mary Hartwell walked toward him slowly, her children following like a small parade. When she reached him, she stopped just close enough to speak without the whole crowd hearing. Mr. Morrison, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what you expect from us, but I want you to know that we're not broken. We're not charity cases. We're people who've had some bad luck, but we're willing to work hard for our keep. Samuel looked into her eyes, brown eyes flecked with gold that held intelligence and strength and just a touch of fear. Behind her, Rebecca watched him with the same serious expression, while the twins flanked their sister like young soldiers. The little girl had emerged completely from hiding now, and the baby had settled into peaceful sleep against his mother's shoulder. Ma'am, Samuel said, tipping his hat slightly, I expect you to make yourselves at home. Beyond that, I reckon we'll figure things out as we go. The wagon wheels creaked loudly as they rolled away from Cheyenne, carrying Samuel Morrison and his unexpected new family toward an uncertain future. Little Emma sat between Samuel and Mary on the driver's bench, her small hands gripping the wooden seat as she stared wide-eyed at the endless prairie stretching before them. How far is your ranch, Mr. Morrison? Rebecca asked from the wagon bed, where she sat with her twin brothers and baby Christopher. About 8 miles, Samuel replied, glancing back at the serious-faced girl. We'll be there before supper time. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and Samuel noticed Mary adjusting her bonnet to shield baby Christopher from the harsh light. Dust kicked up by the horses coated everything with a fine layer of grit that made Emma sneeze every few minutes. Bless you, little one, Mary said softly, pulling a handkerchief from her sleeve to wipe Emma's nose. As they traveled, Samuel found himself stealing glances at his passengers. The twin boys, Joshua and Jacob, whispered quietly to each other, pointing at hawks circling overhead and prairie dogs scurrying between clumps of sagebrush. Rebecca kept a protective eye on everyone, especially when the wagon hit rough spots that made baby Christopher fuss. "Look, Mama," Emma suddenly exclaimed, pointing at a small herd of antelope bounding across the grassland. "They're dancing." Mary smiled, the first genuine smile Samuel had seen from her. "They are beautiful, aren't they?" The simple exchange made something warm spread through Samuel's chest. For months, his world had been nothing but silence and sorrow. Hearing a child's laughter and a mother's gentle response felt like water after a long drought. When they crested the final hill, Samuel's ranch came into view below them. The house sat in a small valley beside a winding creek, with a red barn, chicken coop, and several smaller outbuildings scattered around the property. Fields of wheat and corn stretched toward the distant mountains, and a small herd of cattle grazed peacefully in the pasture. "Oh my," Mary breathed, taking in the sight. "It's not much," Samuel said quickly, suddenly embarrassed by the property's modest appearance. "The house needs work, and the barn roof leaks when it rains hard." "It's wonderful," Rebecca said firmly from behind them. "It looks like a real home." As they pulled up to the house, Samuel's dog Rex came bounding around the corner, barking enthusiastically at the newcomers. Emma squealed with delight and clapped her hands, while the twins immediately began discussing whether they thought Rex was friendly. "He's harmless," Samuel assured them as he helped Mary down from the wagon. "Biggest danger is getting licked to death." The house felt strange with so many people inside it. Samuel had grown accustomed to the echo of his own footsteps and the tick of the mantel clock being the only sounds. Now there were voices everywhere. Children asking questions, Mary quietly discussing sleeping arrangements with Rebecca, baby Christopher making soft cooing noises. "The main bedroom is yours, Mrs. Hartwell," Samuel said, carrying in their few belongings. "I'll bunk in the small room off the kitchen." "That's very kind, Mr. Morrison, but we couldn't put you out of your own room," Mary protested. "It's settled," Samuel said firmly. "Margaret always said the master bedroom should go to the lady of the house." An awkward silence followed his mention of his late wife. Samuel immediately regretted bringing her up, but Mary surprised him by stepping closer. "She sounds like she was a wise woman," Mary said gently. "I hope someday you'll tell me about her." That evening, Samuel sat at his kitchen table, watching controlled chaos unfold around him. Rebecca helped her mother prepare a simple supper of beans and cornbread, while the twins explored every corner of the house with Emma trailing behind them like a devoted puppy. Baby Christopher lay contentedly in a makeshift crib Samuel had quickly assembled from a wooden crate and some old blankets. "Mr. Morrison," Rebecca said as she set plates around the table, "may I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you really buy us today?" Her brown eyes were serious and direct. "And please don't say it was just kindness. I saw your face during the bidding. There was something more." Samuel paused, a spoonful of beans halfway to his mouth. The question caught him off guard with its bluntness, but he respected the girl's directness. "I suppose," he said slowly, "it was because I knew what it felt like to lose everything that mattered, and I couldn't stand the thought of you all being separated." "But you lost your money too," Joshua piped up from across the table. "Now you can't save your ranch." "Joshua," Mary scolded, but Samuel held up a hand. "It's a fair question," Samuel said. "Truth is, I probably wasn't going to be able to save it anyway. At least this way, the money went to something worthwhile." Jacob, who had been quietly eating, suddenly looked up. "What happens to us if you lose the ranch?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Samuel realized he didn't have a good answer. He'd acted on impulse at the auction, driven by emotion rather than practical planning. "We'll figure it out," he said finally. Somehow, after supper, as Mary tucked the children into their beds, Samuel stepped onto the front porch. The night was clear and cool, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black cloth. He could hear Mary's voice drifting from the house as she sang a soft lullaby to baby Christopher. "Beautiful night," Mary said, joining him on the porch a few minutes later. "Most nights are out here," Samuel replied. "Gets lonely sometimes, though." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the creek babbling nearby and the distant call of a night bird. "Mr. Morrison," Mary said eventually, "I want you to know that we won't be a burden to you. The children and I are hard workers. Rebecca is excellent with numbers. She kept all of Thomas's accounts. The twins are strong for their age, and Emma, well, she has a way of making people smile even on difficult days. And you, Mrs. Hartwell? What are your particular talents?" Mary was quiet for so long that Samuel wondered if he'd offended her. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of pride mixed with sadness. "I can read and write better than most men. I taught school for 3 years before I married Thomas. I know how to manage a household on very little money, how to make clothes last twice as long as they should, and how to turn the plainest ingredients into a decent meal." She paused. "And I know how to make hard decisions when they need making." Something in her tone made Samuel look at her more closely. In the moonlight, he could see the determined set of her jaw and the straight line of her shoulders. "What kind of hard decisions?" he asked. Mary turned to face him directly. "The kind that might help save your ranch, Mr. Morrison. If you're willing to listen." The rooster's crow woke Samuel before dawn, just as it had every morning for the past 5 years. But today, instead of the usual silence that followed, he heard soft voices and the gentle sounds of people already moving about. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted from the kitchen, and for a moment, Samuel wondered if he was still dreaming. He dressed quickly and walked toward the kitchen, stopping short in the doorway. Rebecca stood at the stove, expertly flipping bacon while Mary nursed baby Christopher at the table. The twins were already dressed and eating breakfast, and little Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, playing with Rex. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," Rebecca said cheerfully. "I hope you don't mind that we started breakfast. Mama thought you might be hungry after yesterday." Samuel rubbed his eyes, still adjusting to the sight of his kitchen full of people. "I don't mind at all. Smells wonderful." As he sat down with his coffee, Mary finished feeding the baby and handed him to Rebecca. Then she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out several sheets of paper covered with neat handwriting and columns of numbers. "I stayed up late last night working on this," she said, spreading the papers on the table. "I hope you don't think I'm being too forward, but I looked at some of your account books." Samuel's eyebrows rose. "You went through my papers?" "Only the ones left open on your desk," Mary said quickly. "I wasn't snooping, I promise. But I am good with numbers, and I could see you were struggling with more than just the mortgage." She pointed to the first sheet of paper. "Your cattle operation is actually more profitable than you realize. The problem is you're not keeping track of your expenses properly, so you don't know which parts of the ranch make money and which parts lose money." Samuel leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "What do you mean?" "Look here," Mary said, her finger tracing down a column of figures. "You sold 42 head of cattle last spring for $800. But you spent nearly $300 on feed during the winter, plus veterinary costs, plus labor for branding and roundup. Your actual profit was only about $300, not the $800 you were counting on." The twins stopped eating to listen, and even little Emma seemed to sense that something important was happening. Rebecca continued cooking but kept glancing over at the conversation. "Now look at this," Mary continued, pointing to another section. "Your wheat crop brought in $450, and your expenses were less than $100. That's much better profit than the cattle, but you're treating it like a side business instead of your main focus." Samuel studied the numbers, beginning to see patterns he'd never noticed before. "So you're saying I should grow more wheat and run fewer cattle?" "Not exactly," Mary said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "I'm saying you should make decisions based on facts instead of guessing. And there's more." She pulled out another sheet of paper, this one covered with a detailed drawing of the ranch property. "I walked around the property early this morning," she said. "You have that section of land near the creek that's too wet for wheat but perfect for vegetables. And there's a market for fresh vegetables in Cheyenne. I saw the prices yesterday at the general store." Rebecca brought Samuel a plate of bacon and eggs, then sat down to listen. "Mama knows all about vegetable farming," she said proudly. "She had the best garden in our old town. That's not all, Mary continued, warming to her subject. Your chicken coop could hold twice as many birds, and eggs sell for good money in town. Plus, if we expanded the garden and preserved vegetables for winter, we could cut your food expenses by half. Samuel was amazed by the thoroughness of Mary's analysis. She had clearly spent hours thinking through every aspect of the ranch's operations. But here's the most important part, Mary said, leaning forward intently. None of this matters if we can't buy you more time with the bank. How much do you owe, and when is it due? Samuel hesitated. Discussing his financial troubles with a woman he'd known for less than 24 hours felt strange and uncomfortable. It's all right if you don't want to tell me, Mary said gently, but I might be able to help if I knew the details. Something in her voice, a combination of competence and genuine concern, made Samuel decide to trust her. He went to his desk and returned with a folder of papers. I owe $627, he said quietly. Payment is due in 6 weeks. If I can't pay, the bank takes the ranch. Mary studied the mortgage papers carefully, her lips moving slightly as she calculated figures in her head. What if we could show the bank that the ranch was becoming more profitable? She asked. Banks don't want to foreclose if they think they'll eventually get their money. They'd rather work with you than try to sell the property. But 6 weeks isn't enough time to change anything, Samuel protested. Maybe not to change everything, Mary agreed. But it might be enough to show them we have a solid plan. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the ranch with the appraising eye of someone seeing possibilities instead of problems. What if we could make a partial payment and present them with a detailed business plan showing how we'll pay the rest? She asked. Rebecca is excellent at presentation. She helped her father with his business dealings. And I know how to talk to bankers. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, trying to absorb everything Mary had proposed. The twins had finished eating and were playing quietly with Emma and Rex, but he could tell they were listening to every word. There's something else, Mary said, turning back from the window. Something I haven't told you yet. The tone of her voice made everyone in the room look up. Even baby Christopher seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. Before Thomas died, he was working on a business venture with a man from Denver, a contract to supply beef to the new railroad construction camps. Thomas died before he could complete the arrangements, but I still have all the correspondence. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick envelope. The railroad is still looking for reliable suppliers. The contract would be worth over $2,000. Samuel's heart began to beat faster. $2,000 would not only save the ranch, it would set them up for years to come. Why didn't you mention this before? He asked. Mary's cheeks colored slightly. Because the contract requires a ranch that can guarantee delivery of at least 100 head of cattle. Thomas was planning to partner with 2 other ranchers to meet the requirement. Your herd is only about 60 head. The excitement that had been building in Samuel's chest deflated like a punctured balloon. So it won't work. Actually, Mary said with a small smile, I think it might. I noticed yesterday that Jeremiah Cobb runs his cattle in the pasture that borders your eastern boundary. And Pete Jenkins mentioned that he's been looking for someone to manage his small herd. Samuel began to see where her thinking was leading. You're suggesting a partnership. I'm suggesting we ask them. The worst they can say is no. But if they agree, we'd have enough cattle to fulfill the railroad contract, and everyone would profit. Rebecca looked up from where she'd been quietly listening. Mama, what if Mr. Cobb says no because he's still angry about the auction? It was a valid concern. Jeremiah Cobb wasn't known for his forgiving nature, and being outbid publicly would have wounded his pride. Then we find another way, Mary said firmly. But we won't know until we try. Samuel looked around the table at the faces watching him expectantly. These people, this family, had been in his life for less than a day, but they were already changing everything about how he saw his future. All right, he said finally. Let's try. The thunderous sound of hoofbeats approaching the Morrison ranch at dawn sent Rex into a frenzy of barking that woke the entire household. Samuel grabbed his rifle and peered through the kitchen window, his heart sinking when he recognized the riders, Jeremiah Cobb and 3 of his ranch hands. their faces grim in the early morning light. "Stay inside," Samuel told Mary as he stepped onto the porch, but she ignored his instruction and followed him out, baby Christopher in her arms and the other children clustering behind her. Cobb dismounted slowly, his cold eyes taking in the scene with obvious displeasure. The man's jaw was set tight, and Samuel could see the anger radiating from him like heat from a forge. "Morrison," Cobb said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that made smart men step carefully. "We need to talk." "I'm listening," Samuel replied, keeping his own voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. Cobb's gaze shifted to Mary and the children, lingering on them with an expression that made Samuel's grip tighten on his rifle. "Seems you've been busy since yesterday's auction. Setting up quite the little arrangement here." "The Hartwell family is working for me," Samuel said carefully. "Everything's legal and proper." "Legal maybe," Cobb sneered, "but proper? That's a matter of opinion." One of Cobb's men, a thin fellow with mean eyes named Buck Wheeler, spat tobacco juice into the dirt near the porch steps. "Word in town is you got yourself a ready-made family without the trouble of courting. Some folks find that mighty convenient." Samuel felt his temper flare, but before he could respond, Mary stepped forward. Her voice was calm but carried an edge of steel that surprised everyone present. "Mr. Cobb, if you have business with Mr. Morrison, I suggest you state it plainly. Otherwise, you're trespassing on private property and frightening children." Cobb's eyebrows rose at being addressed so directly by a woman, especially one who had been up for auction just yesterday. His men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, clearly not expecting this kind of boldness. "You got spine, lady. I'll give you that," Cobb said. "But spine don't change facts. And the fact is, Morrison here cost me something yesterday, and I aim to collect what's owed." "I don't owe you anything, Cobb," Samuel said firmly. "Don't you?" Cobb's smile was cold as winter. "That family was supposed to come work for me. I had plans for them, arrangements made. Your little bidding war disrupted legitimate business." Rebecca stepped protectively in front of her younger siblings, her young face showing more courage than many grown men possessed. "We're not property to be passed around like cattle," she said clearly. Cobb's attention focused on the teenage girl with uncomfortable intensity. "Young lady, you'd do well to learn your place and keep quiet when your betters are talking." The threatening tone in Cobb's voice triggered something primal in Samuel. He stepped down from the porch, putting himself between Cobb and the family. "That's enough," Samuel said, his voice carrying a warning. "State your business or ride out." Cobb's hand moved casually toward the pistol at his hip, a gesture his men mirrored. The morning air suddenly felt thick with tension, like the moments before a lightning strike. "My business is this," Cobb said slowly. "I'm offering to buy that family from you. $1,000 cash money. That's enough to save your ranch and leave you with profit besides." The offer hit Samuel like a physical blow. $1,000 was more money than he'd ever seen at one time. It would solve all his problems, secure his future, and give him everything he'd been fighting for. "Mr. Morrison," Mary said quietly, "may we speak privately for a moment?" Samuel nodded, and they stepped aside, though not far enough to avoid Cobb's suspicious glare. Mary's voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke. "Don't even consider it," she said fiercely. "Whatever he's planning for us, it won't be good. I've heard stories about the families who go to work for Jeremiah Cobb." "What kind of stories?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he already knew. "The kind where children work 16-hour days and families get split up when they're no longer useful. The kind where accidents happen to people who cause trouble." Samuel looked into Mary's brown eyes and saw fear there, but also determination. Behind her, the children watched anxiously, Rebecca holding baby Christopher while the twins flanked little Emma protectively. "The money would save everything," Samuel said reluctantly. "Would it?" Mary asked. "Would you be able to live with yourself knowing what happened to us? Would you be able to sleep in that house knowing you sold a family like livestock?" Her words cut deep because Samuel knew she was right. The money would save his ranch, but it would destroy his soul. They returned to where Cobb waited, his patience clearly wearing thin. Samuel straightened his shoulders and looked the man directly in the eye. "The family stays with me," Samuel said firmly. "They're not for sale." Cobb's face darkened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "That's a mistake, Morrison. A bad one." "Maybe," Samuel acknowledged, "but it's my mistake to make." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other while tension crackled between them like electricity. Then Cobb remounted his horse with deliberate slowness. "This isn't over," he said, his voice carrying promise of future trouble. "I always get what I want, one way or another." As Cobb and his men rode away, Samuel felt both relief and dread. He'd won this confrontation, but he knew it was just the beginning of a larger war. "Thank you," Mary said simply, touching his arm briefly. "Don't thank me yet," Samuel replied, watching the dust cloud from Cobb's departure. "Something tells me we're going to pay a price for this." Later that morning, as the family worked on expanding the vegetable garden, Rebecca approached Samuel with a worried expression. "Mr. Morrison, I need to tell you something," she said, glancing around to make sure her mother wasn't listening. "Last night, I heard voices outside my window, men talking quietly." Samuel's blood chilled. "What kind of talking?" "They were discussing the layout of the ranch, where the barn was, how many people lived here. One of them mentioned something about teaching folks a lesson about interfering in other people's business." The implication was clear. Cobb's men had been scouting the property, probably planning some kind of retaliation. Samuel felt a surge of protective anger toward this family that had somehow become his responsibility in less than 2 days. "Did you recognize any voices?" he asked. Rebecca nodded grimly. "Buck Wheeler was one of them. I'd know that nasty laugh anywhere." Samuel made a mental note to start keeping watch at night and to make sure his rifle was always loaded. Jeremiah Cobb was clearly planning something, and Samuel intended to be ready when it came. The acrid smell of smoke woke Samuel from a restless sleep just after midnight, 3 days after Cobb's threatening visit. He bolted upright in his bed, instantly alert, and threw open his window to confirm his worst fears. Orange flames were licking at the walls of his barn, casting dancing shadows across the ranch yard. "Fire!" he shouted, grabbing his pants and boots while running toward the main house. "Everyone up! The barn's burning!" Within seconds, the house erupted with activity. Mary appeared in her robe, baby Christopher crying in her arms, while Rebecca herded the twins and Emma toward the door. The smell of smoke was getting stronger by the minute, and Samuel could hear his cattle bellowing in distress from the pasture. "Rebecca, take the children to the creek and keep them there," Mary ordered, her voice calm despite the chaos. "Don't come back until we tell you it's safe." "But Mama," Rebecca started to protest. "Go," Mary said firmly. "Take care of your brothers and sister." Samuel was already running toward the barn with 2 water buckets, his heart pounding as he saw how quickly the flames were spreading. The structure was old and dry, perfect fuel for a fire that seemed to be burning with unnatural intensity. Mary appeared beside him with more buckets, having somehow found time to dress and organize a firefighting effort. "The well pump is behind the house," she called over the roar of the flames. "I'll start a bucket line." As they worked frantically to save what they could, Samuel's mind raced through the implications. This was no accident, the timing was too convenient, the fire too well placed to be natural. Someone had deliberately set his barn ablaze, and he had a pretty good idea who. The twins appeared despite their sister's orders to stay away, carrying buckets of water from the creek. Even little Emma helped, running back and forth with smaller containers that barely held a cupful but showed tremendous courage for a 6-year-old. "The hay loft is gone," Mary called out, pointing to where flames had completely engulfed the upper level of the barn. "We need to focus on saving the walls and foundation." For 2 hours, they fought the fire with desperate determination. By the time the flames were finally extinguished, the barn was a smoking ruin, the roof completely gone, the walls blackened and partially collapsed, and most of Samuel's stored hay and equipment destroyed. As dawn broke over the devastated scene, Samuel surveyed the damage with a sinking heart. The financial loss was catastrophic. He'd need hundreds of dollars to rebuild. Money he simply didn't have. Worse, without proper shelter for his cattle and storage for winter feed, the ranch operation would be severely crippled. "I'm sorry," Mary said quietly, standing beside him as they watched smoke continue to rise from the smoldering ruins. "Not your fault," Samuel replied, though his voice was heavy with defeat. "This is about more than the fire." Someone wanted to send a message. Rebecca approached them carrying a piece of charred wood with something carved into it. "Mr. Morrison, I found this near where the fire started. It looks like letters." Samuel took the wood and studied the crude carving. Though partially burned, he could make out the letters JC carved deep into the surface. "Jeremiah Cobb," Mary breathed, understanding immediately. "Probably," Samuel agreed grimly, though proving it would be another matter entirely. The sound of approaching horses made everyone tense, but this time it was Doc Williams and Pete Jenkins from town, along with several other neighbors who had seen the smoke and come to help. "Good Lord, Sam," Doc Williams said, dismounting and surveying the damage. "What happened here?" "Barn fire," Samuel replied simply, not wanting to make accusations he couldn't prove. Pete Jenkins walked around the perimeter of the ruins, his experienced eye taking in details that others might miss. When he returned, his expression was troubled. "Sam, this fire didn't start natural," he said quietly. "Burn patterns all wrong, and there's traces of kerosene over here by the north wall." The confirmation of Samuel's suspicions felt like another blow. He'd been hoping against hope that maybe it really had been an accident, that his growing conflict with Cobb hadn't escalated to outright sabotage. "Who would do such a thing?" Doc Williams asked, though his tone suggested he had his own suspicions. Before anyone could answer, the sound of more horses approaching made everyone turn. This time it was Sheriff Bradley from Cheyenne, a fair-minded man who Samuel respected but who also had to work carefully around powerful men like Jeremiah Cobb. "Heard about the fire," Sheriff Bradley said, dismounting and tipping his hat to Mary. "Anyone hurt?" "No injuries," Samuel reported. "But the barn's a total loss." The sheriff walked around the ruins just as Pete had done, asking quiet questions and examining the evidence. When he finished, he pulled Samuel aside for a private conversation. "Sam, I'm going to ask you straight out. Do you have any idea who might have done this?" Samuel hesitated. Accusing Jeremiah Cobb without solid proof could bring even more trouble down on his family. But saying nothing might encourage more attacks. "I've had some disagreements with folks lately," Samuel said carefully. "Nothing I can prove, but tensions have been running high since the auction." Sheriff Bradley nodded knowingly. "I heard about that business. Also heard there's been some talk around town about your arrangement with the Hartwell family." "What kind of talk?" "The kind that suggests some people think you're getting above yourself, taking on responsibilities that might be better handled by others." The message was clear. Powerful people in the territory were displeased with Samuel's actions, and those people had ways of expressing their displeasure that stayed just inside the boundaries of the law. "Sheriff," Mary said, approaching the two men with baby Christopher in her arms. "What protection do we have if someone is targeting our family?" Sheriff Bradley's expression was sympathetic but not encouraging. "Ma'am, without witnesses or solid evidence, there's not much the law can do. My advice would be to keep your eyes open and avoid giving anyone more reasons to cause trouble." After the sheriff and neighbors departed, the Morrison ranch felt isolated and vulnerable. The blackened skeleton of the barn stood as a stark reminder of how quickly their new life could be destroyed. "What do we do now?" Rebecca asked, voicing the question everyone was thinking. Samuel looked at the faces watching him expectantly. Mary holding her baby, the twins standing protectively near their little sister, Rebecca showing the kind of mature concern that no 14-year-old should have to carry. "We rebuild," he said firmly, surprised by the strength in his own voice. "We rebuild, and we don't let anyone scare us away from what's right." Mary stepped closer to him, her brown eyes reflecting both gratitude and determination. "Together," Samuel confirmed, and for the first time since the fire started, He felt hope beginning to kindle in his chest like a flame that refused to be extinguished. The banker's polished shoes clicked against the wooden floor of the Cheyenne First National Bank as he paced behind his mahogany desk, studying the papers Mary had carefully prepared over the past week. Samuel sat rigidly in the uncomfortable chair across from him, while Mary held baby Christopher and tried to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Mr. Morrison," Banker Harrison said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a man who held other people's futures in his hands. "These projections are quite impressive, but projections and reality are often very different things." Samuel's heart sank. They had worked day and night to prepare this presentation. Detailed plans for expanding the vegetable operation, contracts with the railroad for beef delivery, and careful calculations showing how the ranch could become profitable within 6 months. "Sir," Mary said respectfully, "every number in those reports is based on actual market prices and realistic production estimates. My late husband was in the cattle business, and I've been managing household finances for over 10 years. Banker Harrison looked at Mary with the kind of patronizing expression that suggested he found it amusing when women discussed financial matters. "Mrs. Hartwell, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but banking decisions must be based on more than a widow's household budgeting experience." The dismissive tone in his voice made Samuel's jaw clench. He started to respond angrily, but Mary placed a gentle hand on his arm, warning him to stay calm. "Mr. Harrison," she continued smoothly, "perhaps you'd be interested to know that these projections were reviewed and approved by Thomas McKenna from the Denver Cattle Association. His letter of endorsement is in the folder." The banker's eyebrows rose as he flipped through the papers to find McKenna's official letterhead. Thomas McKenna was one of the most respected cattle dealers in the territory, and his word carried enormous weight in business circles. "Where did you get this?" Harrison asked, studying the letter carefully. "Mr. McKenna was a business associate of my late husband," Mary explained. "When I wrote to him about the railroad contract opportunity, he was quite enthusiastic about the potential partnership." What Mary didn't mention was that she had spent 3 sleepless nights crafting that letter, drawing on every piece of business knowledge she'd absorbed during her marriage to present their case in the most professional terms possible. "The letter mentions a partnership with other local ranchers," Harrison noted. "Have these arrangements been finalized?" Samuel and Mary exchanged a quick glance. This was the weakest part of their plan. They still needed to convince other ranchers to join their venture, and their conflict with Jeremiah Cobb made that process much more complicated. "We're in negotiations," Samuel said carefully. "Pete Jenkins has already expressed interest in combining his herd with ours for the railroad contract." This was technically true, though Pete's interest had been more of a casual conversation than a firm commitment. But Samuel figured that if they could secure the bank's cooperation, convincing Pete would be much easier. Banker Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, studying both of them with calculating eyes. The silence stretched uncomfortably as he weighed their proposal against the risks involved. "There's another matter we need to discuss," he said finally. "I've been hearing some concerning rumors about your household arrangements, Mr. Morrison." Samuel felt his stomach drop. He'd been expecting this topic to arise, but hoped it wouldn't become part of the business discussion. "What kind of rumors?" Mary asked, her voice steady despite the tension Samuel could see in her shoulders. "The kind that suggest impropriety," Harrison said bluntly. "A widower taking in a woman and her children under questionable circumstances. Some people are wondering if this is really a business arrangement or something else entirely." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire. Samuel felt his temper rising, but Mary's hand on his arm kept him from exploding. "Mr. Harrison," Mary said with dignity, "my family and I work for Mr. Morrison in exchange for room and board. We maintain separate living quarters, and our arrangement is both legal and proper. If certain people choose to see impropriety where none exists, that says more about their character than ours. Nevertheless," Harrison continued, "the bank must consider community standards when making lending decisions. A loan to someone involved in scandal could reflect poorly on our institution." Samuel could see their carefully planned future crumbling before his eyes. All their hard work, all their hopes, were about to be destroyed by gossip and small-minded thinking. Then Mary did something unexpected. She stood up, handed baby Christopher to Samuel, and walked to the window overlooking Main Street. When she turned back to face the banker, her expression had changed completely. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice carrying a new note of authority, "may I share something with you? Something that might change your perspective on this situation." The banker nodded, clearly curious about what she might reveal. "Before my husband died, he discovered that certain prominent members of this community were involved in questionable business practices. Practices that might interest territorial authorities if they came to light." Harrison's face went pale. "What kind of practices?" "The kind involving land claims that weren't entirely legal, and cattle that didn't always belong to the people selling them." Mary's voice remained calm, but her eyes were steel. "Thomas kept detailed records of everything he observed. Those records are now in my possession." Samuel stared at Mary in amazement. He had no idea she possessed such information, or that she would be bold enough to use it as leverage in a business negotiation. "Are you threatening me, Mrs. Hartwell?" Harrison asked carefully. "Not at all," Mary replied smoothly. "I'm simply pointing out that everyone in this territory has secrets, Mr. Harrison. The question is whether we're going to help each other succeed, or whether we're going to let petty gossip destroy legitimate business opportunities." The banker was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and dipped his pen in ink. "Very well," he said. "I'm prepared to offer a 6-month extension on your mortgage, Mr. Morrison, with the understanding that you'll make a substantial payment at that time. The extension will cost you $50 in fees, and the remaining balance will accrue interest at 8%. It wasn't everything they'd hoped for, but it was enough. 6 months would give them time to make their plans work, time to prove that their partnership could succeed. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," Samuel said, relief flooding through him. As they prepared to leave, Harrison stopped them with one final comment. "Mrs. Hartwell, I trust that those records you mentioned will remain private, assuming our business relationship proceeds smoothly." Mary smiled sweetly. "Of course, Mr. Harrison. I'm not interested in causing trouble for anyone. I'm only interested in building a good life for my family." Outside the bank, Samuel looked at Mary with new respect and a touch of wariness. "Where did you learn to negotiate like that?" "Being married to a businessman for 8 years, she replied, "and being desperate enough to use every advantage I have." "Did Thomas really keep records about illegal activities?" Mary's smile was enigmatic. "Thomas was a very thorough man, Mr. Morrison. Very thorough indeed." As they walked toward their wagon, Samuel realized that Mary Hartwell was far more complicated and resourceful than he'd initially understood. The woman who had stood on the auction block just weeks ago was revealing herself to be a formidable ally, and possibly a dangerous enemy to anyone who threatened her family. The sound of hammering rang across the Morrison ranch as the entire community worked together to raise the frame of the new barn, just 2 weeks after Mary's successful negotiation with the bank. Samuel paused in his work to wipe sweat from his forehead and marvel at the sight before him. Neighbors who had barely spoken to him before were now contributing their time and labor to help rebuild what had been destroyed. "Hand me that beam, would you, Sam?" called out Pete Jenkins from atop the half-completed structure. The store owner had surprised everyone by showing up at dawn with a wagon full of lumber and a determination to help that went far beyond casual neighborliness. Doc Williams worked alongside the twins, teaching them proper techniques for driving nails while sharing stories that kept them laughing despite the hard work. Even old Mrs. Patterson from town had arrived with baskets of food and fresh bandages, prepared to tend any injuries that might occur during the construction. Mary moved between the workers like a general organizing troops, keeping track of supplies, coordinating meals, and somehow managing to nurse baby Christopher while supervising the entire operation. Rebecca had taken charge of the younger children, keeping Emma entertained while making sure everyone stayed safely away from the dangerous work areas. "Never seen anything like it," Pete commented during a water break, gesturing toward the bustling activity. "Folks who wouldn't give you the time of day 3 weeks ago are now working their fingers to the bone for you." Samuel nodded, still amazed by the transformation. "Mary says it's because people respect folks who stand up for what's right," even when it costs them something. That woman of yours has quite a head on her shoulders, Pete observed. Heard she convinced Harrison to extend your mortgage by threatening to expose half the territory's dirty laundry. She's not my woman, Samuel protested automatically, though the words felt strange in his mouth. She works for me. Pete gave him a look that suggested he wasn't fooled by the formal arrangement. Sam, I've known you for 5 years, and I've never seen you look at anyone the way you look at Mary Hartwell. And she looks at you the same way, in case you haven't noticed. Before Samuel could respond, shouts erupted from the direction of the road. Everyone stopped working to see a cloud of dust approaching fast, riders coming hard toward the ranch. Samuel's blood chilled as he recognized the lead horse and rider. Jeremiah Cobb was returning, and this time he had twice as many men with him. Everyone stay calm, Samuel called out, though his own heart was racing. He grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against a fence post, and several of the other men did the same. Cobb reined in his horse just outside the work area, his cold eyes surveying the barn raising with obvious displeasure. His men spread out in a semicircle, hands resting casually near their weapons. Well, well, Cobb said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. Looks like you've got quite the party going here, Morrison. Just neighbors helping neighbors, Samuel replied evenly. Nothing that concerns you. Everything in this territory concerns me, Cobb shot back, especially when it involves people who don't know their place. Mary stepped forward from where she'd been helping serve lunch, baby Christopher still in her arms. Her movement was deliberate and confident, showing no fear despite the obvious danger. Mr. Cobb, she said clearly, if you have business here, please state it. Otherwise, you're interfering with legal work on private property. Cobb's attention focused on Mary with the intensity of a predator spotting prey. You've got quite a mouth on you for someone who was bought and paid for just a few weeks ago. The insult hit its target, but instead of backing down, Mary stepped closer. I was never bought, Mr. Cobb. I was rescued. There's a difference, though I don't expect you to understand it. A murmur of approval ran through the gathered workers. Samuel felt a surge of pride at Mary's courage, even as he worried about provoking Cobb further. Rescued? Cobb laughed harshly. Is that what you call it when a desperate man buys himself a ready-made family? I call it what it is, Mary replied steadily. A good man helping people in need, without expecting anything in return except honest work. Pete Jenkins stepped forward, still holding his hammer. Cobb, you've said your piece. Time to move along. Other voices joined in, creating a chorus of support that clearly surprised Cobb. He'd expected to find Samuel isolated and vulnerable, not backed by half the community. This isn't over, Cobb said, his voice carrying a promise of future trouble. You think you've won something here, but you're wrong. Dead wrong. He wheeled his horse around and rode off with his men, leaving behind a tense silence that gradually gave way to resumed hammering and conversation. But Samuel noticed that several of the neighbors began making excuses to leave earlier than planned. Cobb's visit had reminded everyone that supporting the Morrison ranch came with risks, and not everyone was willing to face those risks. As evening approached and the last of the helpers departed, Samuel stood with Mary on the porch, watching the sun set behind their partially completed barn. We made good progress today, Mary said, shifting baby Christopher to her other arm. Thanks to you, Samuel replied. The way you stood up to Cobb, I've never seen anything like it. Mary was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Samuel, there's something I need to tell you. Something about why Cobb is so determined to cause us trouble. The serious tone in her voice made Samuel turn to look at her directly. What do you mean? Those business records I mentioned to the banker? They include information about Cobb. Specifically, about how he's been using his influence to force small ranchers to sell their land for far less than it's worth. Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of information? The kind that could put him in prison, Mary said quietly. Thomas documented everything, the threats, the intimidation, the illegal cattle acquisitions. Cobb has been building his empire by destroying other people's lives. And he knows you have these records? Mary nodded grimly. I think he suspects, which means he'll keep escalating until he either gets what he wants or eliminates the threat entirely. The implications of her words settled over Samuel like a heavy blanket. They weren't just dealing with a man's wounded pride or business competition. They were dealing with someone who saw them as a direct threat to his criminal activities. What do we do? Samuel asked. Mary looked at him with an expression that mixed determination with tenderness. We finish what we started. We build our life, we protect our family, and we refuse to be intimidated by bullies. Our family, Samuel repeated, struck by her choice of words. Mary's cheeks colored slightly, but she didn't look away. Yes, Samuel, our family, because that's what we've become, whether we planned it or not. Standing there in the gathering dusk with the sounds of his children, for that's how he'd begun thinking of them. Drifting from the house, Samuel realized that Mary was right. Somewhere between the auction and this moment, they had indeed become a family. Not the traditional kind, not the kind that followed conventional rules, but a family nonetheless. And like any family worth having, it was worth fighting for. The crack of rifle shots echoed across the Morrison ranch just before midnight, shattering the peaceful silence and sending everyone in the house bolting upright in their beds. Samuel grabbed his Winchester and rushed to the window, his heart pounding as he peered into the darkness where muzzle flashes lit up the night like deadly fireflies. Stay down, he shouted to Mary and the children as more shots rang out, this time closer to the house. Glass exploded from the kitchen window, sending shards across the floor where little Emma had been playing just hours before. Mary crawled across the floor toward the children's room, baby Christopher crying in her arms, while Rebecca herded the twins and Emma into the safest corner of the house. The sound of hoofbeats thundered around the property as riders circled like wolves around a campfire. Morrison! A voice called out from the darkness, Buck Wheeler's unmistakable sneer carrying across the yard. Come out and face what's coming to you. Samuel positioned himself by the front window, his rifle ready but his mind racing. There had to be at least 6 men out there, maybe more, and they had the advantage of darkness and mobility. Fighting them directly would be suicide, especially with innocent children in the house. What do you want, Wheeler? Samuel called back, stalling for time while he tried to think of a plan. We want the woman and her brats, Wheeler shouted. Mr. Cobbs decided they belong with him after all. You can give them up easy, or we can take them hard. Your choice. A surge of protective rage flooded through Samuel's veins. The idea of these men laying hands on Mary or the children made him see red, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting angry wouldn't help anyone right now. Like hell, Samuel muttered under his breath, then called out louder, The family stays here. You're trespassing on my land. His answer was another volley of gunfire that splintered the wooden shutters and sent bullets whining through the air. One shot came so close to Samuel's head that he felt the wind from its passage. Mary appeared beside him, staying low but carrying a shotgun that Samuel didn't even know she owned. Her face was pale but determined, and her hands were steady on the weapon. Where did you get that? Samuel asked in amazement. Thomas taught me to shoot, she replied grimly. Said a woman living in the territories needed to know how to protect herself. From the children's room came Rebecca's voice, calm and reassuring as she tried to keep her younger siblings from panicking. It's going to be all right, she was saying. Mr. Morrison won't let anyone hurt us. The confidence in the teenager's voice made Samuel's chest tight with emotion. These children trusted him completely, believed he could protect them from anything. He couldn't let them down. There's something else, Mary whispered urgently. I hid Thomas's records in the old well behind the house. If something happens to us, those papers are the only evidence of Cobb's crimes. Nothing's going to happen to us, Samuel said firmly, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. Another round of gunfire erupted, this time accompanied by the smell of smoke. Samuel's blood turned to ice as he realized what was happening. They're trying to burn us out, Mary said, confirming his fears. Through the broken window, Samuel could see orange flames beginning to lick at the newly built barn. The sight filled him with helpless fury. All the work, all the community effort, all their hopes for the future going up in smoke again. But then he heard something that changed everything. The distant sound of approaching horses, lots of them, coming fast from the direction of town. "What's that?" Mary asked, hearing the same sound. Samuel listened carefully, trying to count the riders. "Sounds like cavalry," he said hopefully. The shooting from outside suddenly stopped as Cobb's men apparently heard the approaching horses too. Voices called out in the darkness, urgent and worried, as the attackers tried to figure out what was happening. "Wheeler!" A new voice boomed across the yard. Sheriff Bradley's authoritative tone cutting through the night. "This is the law. Throw down your weapons and surrender." What followed was chaos. Some of Cobb's men apparently decided to fight it out, because gunfire erupted again, this time between the attackers and what sounded like a substantial posse. Other riders could be heard galloping away into the darkness, abandoning their companions. The battle raged for nearly 10 minutes before the shooting finally stopped. Then came the blessed sound of Sheriff Bradley's voice calling out, "Morrison, you and your family all right in there?" Samuel felt weak with relief as he called back, "We're okay, Sheriff." Coming out, they emerged from the house to find the yard filled with armed men from town. Not just the sheriff, but Pete Jenkins, Doc Williams, and a dozen other neighbors who had apparently organized themselves into a rescue party. "How did you know to come?" Samuel asked in amazement. "Mrs. Patterson saw riders heading this way after dark," Sheriff Bradley explained. "When she heard gunshots, she raised the alarm. Seems like folks in this territory look after their own." Buck Wheeler lay wounded near the water trough, cursing and holding his shoulder where a bullet had found its mark. 2 other men had been captured, while the rest had escaped into the night. "Where's Cobb?" Samuel asked. "Gone," Sheriff Bradley said grimly. "But we'll find him. This kind of attack can't go unpunished, no matter who's behind it." As dawn broke over the ranch, Samuel stood with Mary surveying the damage. The new barn was partially burned again, and the house would need extensive repairs. But they were alive and they were together, and somehow that felt like victory. "I have something for you, Sheriff," Mary said, disappearing briefly before returning with a thick folder of papers. Evidence of Jeremiah Cobb's criminal activities over the past 5 years. Enough to put him away for a very long time. Sheriff Bradley's eyebrows rose as he flipped through the documents. "Where did these come from?" "My late husband was a careful record keeper," Mary explained. "He documented everything he observed, including illegal land acquisitions and cattle theft." The sheriff studied the papers with growing interest. "This is enough for a territorial warrant," he said finally. "Cobb won't be able to hide from this." As the rescue party prepared to return to town, Pete Jenkins approached Samuel with a serious expression. "Sam, I want you to know something," he said. "After what happened here tonight, there's not a person in this territory who doesn't know what kind of man you are, and what kind of woman Mary Hartwell is too." Samuel nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind Pete's words. The attack had stripped away all pretense and shown everyone where the real battle lines were drawn. "We're going to make this work," Samuel said with conviction. "The ranch, the railroad contract, all of it." "I know you will," Pete replied. "And you won't be doing it alone." The church bells of Cheyenne rang out across the Wyoming territory on a crisp October morning in 1882, calling the entire community to witness something that would have seemed impossible just 3 months earlier. Samuel Morrison stood at the altar in his best suit, his hands shaking slightly as he watched Mary Hartwell walk down the aisle in a simple but beautiful dress that Rebecca had helped her alter from one of Margaret's old gowns. The pews were packed with faces that had become familiar over the past months. Pete Jenkins and his family, Doc Williams, Sheriff Bradley, and dozens of neighbors who had come to celebrate the union of 2 people who had found love in the most unexpected circumstances. Rebecca walked behind her mother, serving as maid of honor, while the twins stood proudly beside Samuel as his best men. Little Emma scattered wildflower petals with serious concentration, and baby Christopher gurgled happily in Doc Williams' arms, having been temporarily adopted as the community mascot. "Dearly beloved," began Reverend Thomas, his voice carrying easily through the packed church, We are gathered here today to witness the marriage of Samuel Morrison and Mary Hartwell, two souls who have found in each other not just love, but the courage to build something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. Samuel looked into Mary's eyes and saw his own amazement reflected there. How had they come so far from that desperate day at the courthouse auction? How had a moment of impulse grown into something so profound and lasting? The months since Cobb's attack had transformed their lives in ways neither could have imagined. With the evidence Mary had provided, territorial authorities had issued warrants for Jeremiah Cobb and his associates. The man himself had fled the territory, but his illegal empire had crumbled, freeing several small ranchers from his intimidation. The railroad contract had proven even more profitable than expected. Their partnership with Pete Jenkins and two other local ranchers had resulted in the successful delivery of cattle to construction camps throughout the region, bringing in enough money to not only save the Morrison Ranch but expand it significantly. "Samuel," the Reverend said, "do you take Mary to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Samuel said, his voice strong and clear despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Mary, do you take Samuel to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Mary replied, tears of joy glistening in her brown eyes. As they exchanged rings, simple gold bands that Samuel had ordered specially from Denver, the church fell silent except for the soft sounds of people wiping away tears and baby Christopher's contented cooing. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Thomas declared. "Samuel, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle and sweet, full of promise for the future they would build together. As they turned to face the congregation, the church erupted in applause and cheers that seemed to shake the very rafters. At the reception held in the church hall, Samuel found himself surrounded by well-wishers and friends who had become like family over the past months. The twins regaled anyone who would listen with detailed accounts of their expanding cattle operation, while Rebecca discussed her plans to attend teachers' college with the serious intensity of someone much older than her 14 years. "Never thought I'd see the day," Pete Jenkins said, raising his glass of punch in a toast. "Here's to Samuel and Mary Morrison. Proof that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places." The crowd drank to the toast with enthusiasm, but Samuel barely heard the words. His attention was focused on Mary, who was across the room teaching little Emma a simple dance step while balancing baby Christopher on her hip. "She's something special, that one," Doc Williams observed, following Samuel's gaze. "Got a backbone of steel and a heart big enough for the whole territory." "Don't I know it?" Samuel replied, marveling again at how dramatically his life had changed. As the afternoon wore on, Samuel found himself stepping outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The October air was crisp and clean, carrying the promise of winter, but also the satisfaction of a successful harvest season. Mary joined him on the church steps, having temporarily handed baby Christopher over to his sister's care. "Any regrets, Mr. Morrison?" she asked with a smile that lit up her entire face. "Just one," Samuel replied, causing her smile to falter slightly. "What's that?" "I regret that it took me so long to realize I was in love with you," he said, pulling her close. "I think I knew it that first night when you stood up to me about helping with the ranch plans. But I was too stubborn to admit it." Mary laughed, the sound like music in the autumn air. "I knew it when you bid on us at the auction. No man spends his last dollars on strangers unless his heart is telling him they won't be strangers for long. So we were both fools then." "Happy fools," Mary corrected, standing on her tiptoes to kiss him again. As they stood together on the church steps, Samuel could see their ranch in the distance, the rebuilt barn standing strong and proud, the expanded fields golden with harvested grain, the cattle grazing peacefully in pastures that now stretched twice as far as they had 6 months ago. "What are you thinking about?" Mary asked, following his gaze. "I'm thinking about that day at the auction," Samuel said. "How desperate everything seemed. How hopeless. I thought I was bidding to save you and the children, but really you saved me. We saved each other," Mary corrected gently. And we're going to keep saving each other every day for the rest of our lives. From inside the church hall came the sounds of laughter and celebration, the voices of children playing and adults sharing stories. It was the sound of community, of belonging, of home. Ready to go back in, Mrs. Morrison? Samuel asked, offering Mary his arm. Ready for anything, Mr. Morrison, she replied, taking his arm with confidence. As long as we're facing it together. As they walked back into their wedding reception, Samuel reflected on how much his understanding of family had changed. Family wasn't just about blood relations or traditional arrangements. Family was about people who chose to stand by each other through good times and bad, who worked together toward common goals, who loved each other not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The Morrison family had begun with a desperate bid at a courthouse auction, but it had grown into something beautiful, strong, and lasting. And as Samuel looked around the room full of friends and neighbors celebrating their new beginning, he knew that sometimes the most extraordinary stories started with the most ordinary act of human kindness. Outside, the Wyoming wind whispered across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of countless tomorrows yet to be written.